the true way our vision works. The first edition of Oris Volume 12 of the ECDology contained only one paragraph about how our vision works. That's where he had described the illusion of our vision, only few sentences really. I immediately understood to myself that this information is really powerful. And as I am aware, it wasn't mentioned anywhere yet publicly. We have asked Oris to elaborate this topic in more detail. I have attempted to put the information together, in order to compare the scientific point of view with what Oris says in the ECDology. The result of our collective work became the 3 pretty large paragraphs, which minutely explain in detail the illusion of our vision. I can tell you right away that this information isn't accepted by the official science. But it exists for a long period of time and is being suppressed. Why? Because up to this point no one had explained how photons become imagery. Where that imagery is originating from, what we actually see. Is it coming from the brain or retina? No one knows. The suppression of this information is vital to modern science, otherwise they would have to admit their complete insolvency and inability to explain the true anatomy of the human eye. So, the science keeps a heavy lid on this since about the end of 19th century. In all medical textbooks it is mentioned that the light is coming into an eye through the pupil, then the lens, activating the rods and cones, which structure the pigmented layer, where the imagery is actually located. However, in reality, which is also mentioned in these textbooks, that this layer is in fact, a non-reactive to any of the photons at all. What that is just a dark plate with no nerve cells altogether, and is not photosensitive in any way. Hence, there is nothing that can actually be reflected on it. It's like an electronics plate, with soldered microchips in it. The rods and cones do not interact with that plate at all. There are no connections between them. In various textbooks it is mentioned that there is a specific substance being generated by the rods and cones, and actually makes them activated. And they transmit the imagery information to the brain's vision center by means of an optic nerve. Well, how do they actually do that? There is no interconnection here with the plate. How do they transmit it if there is nothing there? The question is where this hormone is coming from? How these rods and cones are being activated? Yes, there is a specific hormone is being produced there. Okay, this is what ECDology has to say about this. The light is coming through the lens, but before it reaches the rods and cones, it goes through the 3 transparent cell layers. There are 3 cell layers, which refract this light individually. Each cell does it their own way, in a holographic fashion. The holographic transmission mode is when the information from each cell is being transmitted throughout the whole nerve system. So, the imagery is being deciphered by each cell strictly individually. They all interpret this information in their own way. The eye's microanatomy is very precisely constructed, even though it looks like that is all chaotic. It is not. These 2 layers are interconnected with each other by the corresponding axons. And the relation between all these three layers is also very organized. The impulse is being retranslated in a specific fashion. Before the photons can reach the rods and cones, they get onto the lens first, and then, from the three layers of these neuron mediator cells, get into the brain's visual cortex through the optic nerve.
Сразу поступает, то есть их сигналы на фотоны. Мы распаковали в информацию, да? Пошла форма.
We have just decompressed, unpacked certain information within our self-consciousness, and certain perceptions became active there.
И мы что-то себе уже начинаем представлять.
At that point, almost instantaneously we begin to perceive the surrounding reality in a certain fashion and begin to form our own opinion about it. So, this perception, not reaching the rods and cones, already interconnects with neurons, which immediately begin information transmission into the brain. And unlike it says in textbooks, the signal travels from the mediator cells, not the rods and cones. The information signal is coming from the net of these neuron mediator cells, whose axons actually form the optic nerve. There are millions of these rods and cones, as you know, while the neuron mediator cells quantity is very small, comparing to quantity of rods and cones. There is another inconsistency: the quantity of nerve fibers doesn't match. If rods and cones would actually have them, the optic nerve would be as thick as a cable. Remember, there are millions of them. The information signal from neuron cells goes immediately to the brain form creators and not the rods and cones. Depending on the activity type of brain form creators' second, third and fourth psychic energy centers, the incoming information is being unpacked accordingly. And they, actually, inform the rods and cones of what a person should see. The signal comes from the neuron coordinator cells into the brain's visual cortex form creators, who then transmit the information back to the correlating cells, which are connected with rods and cones, telling them how to interpret this information. The brain form creators instruct the correlating cells, and then the rods and cones, which are immediately being activated to project a very specific imagery. There are approximately 120 million rods and about 6 million cones. Out of them all, only these, which receive the signal from the brain, are being activated at any given instant. The photon wave is still incoming, it's being refracted, the signal to the brain is on its way, the brain sent back the response, but the photons are still incoming. So, the light, photons, is falling onto the rods and cones in their tangent line. The activated rods and cones refract the photons in a very specific fashion. Active rods and cones have a different refraction scale, comparing to the inactive ones. The active rods and cones perceive and interpret the photon wave only in the way the brain form creators have instructed them to. Hence, the ultimate signal from rods and cones is being transmitted as a hologram to all nerve cells in the whole body. Basically, the whole nerve system is involved in such a process, not just our eyes. Again, each cell is transmitting its own part of the holographic image to the whole nerve system, so we perceive it accordingly. Why sometimes we can see by the occiput? Because the signal as to what to see comes from the brain, and not from the lens or rods and cones. There is another interesting point there. Each individual have their own eye microanatomy, which correlates to their organism as a whole. There are only 27 neuron mediator cells in our body altogether. However, within the eye, there are 30 of them. And their structure and interrelation with one another determines the way we see.
как каждый из нас распаковывает. То есть мало того, что творцы индивидуально работают.
Not only the brainstorm creators are totally independent, but each person's vision is totally unique.
Другой человек видит по-другому. А как это организуется?
When the baby is born, their vision works in the low functional mode with the rest of the system active as usual, mostly muscular.
Функциональна вся система остальная организма, в основном мышечная.
The muscle activity gets into correlation with neuron mediators, and all the information collected that way is being then holographically transmitted into the brain's visual cortex. The neuron mediators kind of record all the baby's movements, correlating them all with a distance factor. This correlation process takes approximately 3 years of a human's life. It's similar to the pedestrian's map. It's the same as when someone asks the way to get somewhere: turn right, turn left, go straight, and so on. All neuron mediators actually convince the brainstorm creators that their mutual muscle vision correlation is correct.
Убеждают творцов мозга, что это именно так, чтобы потом, когда ребенок начал видеть, у него идет соотношение.
This is essential for the movement-vision mechanism's correlation. Depending on how the child was developed since birth, the vision system will function. That's why we see the same object differently. One more exciting fact. Orr says that the eye's width and the cell interaction within it influence the activity level.
Вот эта ширина глаза и момент взаимодействия между клеточками влияют на уровень активности.
If a person has higher frequency self-consciousness form creators active, the wavelength between both sides of the eye is shorter.
Длина волны между одной стороной глаза и другой, импульсы, скорость, с которой проходят импульсы, она одна. То есть творцы распаковывают так.
Also, that depends on which perceptions the child is developing. In the early childhood, the baby's perceptions are mostly of his or her parents. Of course, that depends on the parents' perception quality, which they encase in their child. The child could develop a scientist's, musician, or other abilities upon the qualitative perceptions he or she absorbs during childhood.
Обычный человек, который увидит там то, что, не знаю, все серое и так далее, и так далее.
But in any case, all what we see is nothing more than sheer illusion.
Несовпадение еще в чем? Несовпадение в том, что
some additional discrepancies exist between the textbooks and ECDology's versions. According to ECDology, the rods and cones face towards the end of the pigmented plate and can't absorb or reflect light with their ends, unlike what is stated in textbooks. Like I said previously, the light isn't getting even close to rods and cones, since when it actually gets to them from the brainstorm creators, it hits them in tangent line and not in their face. Interconnection between the rods and the mediator cells is pretty versatile. On top of that, these cells are really huge and the refraction is implemented on a large scale. If the eye's microanatomy is rather developed, the inner vision ability increases.
Возможность внутреннего видения повышается. То есть распаковывается форма.
The perception is incoming upon the incoming of photons. The signal travels to the brain. Brain sends back the deciphered command, and all this inner interconnection begins to function as an inner vision. The light, photons, isn't getting to the rods and cones. Factually, we see our perceptions, such as during meditations, hypnosis, conscious dreams, and so on. Small children, before a year old, only see with their inner vision. That includes the perceptions of their parents. They function perfectly without rods and cones activity.
они здесь распаковывают и спокойно. То есть вот это
If that area is
фактически
functionally disrupted, in case with blind people, the information is getting into the brain by means of sense of touch, smell or hearing.
Потом, если у человека нет зрения, допустим, там что-то здесь нарушено, да, функционально, опять же, он
The perception decompressing is the same, mediator cells, brain, mediator cells. If a person has any perceptions about any object, he doesn't need rods and cones to actually see them.
Творцы мозга ответили, и пошла распаковка образа.
It's just that rods and cones is like a multidimensional barcode, which provides the more detailed, sharp and concrete vision. The presence of rods and cones makes the vision much more crisp and clear.
Вообще не имеет к этому никакого отношения. Просто палочки, колбочки, это лучше, это как штрих-код многомерный.
Again, there is no imagery there altogether. It's a holographic multidimensional barcode.
Более серьезно, более, то есть зрение лучше, человек как бы более уверенно себя чувствует, он вот может это распаковать, это увидеть более серьезно.
At this point only the ECDology is capable of explaining the information, the simplified version of which I am telling you now.
Здесь нет. Это чисто штрих-код, многомерный причем. То есть голографический многомерный штрих-код, который просто считывается каждой клеткой отдельно.
The modern science isn't able to explain this yet. Once they resonate with this information, it will capsize the ophthalmology as we know it today.
Никакого изображения ни в мозгу, ни здесь быть не может, не происходит этого. И кроме идеологии, которая объясняет, что все в сознании, что все в ИДС, и что именно распаковывается, и подается команда творцами мозга, и именно голографично передается всей нервной системе, нам никто объяснить это не может. То есть ученые это не объясняют никак.
Because then the doctors and scientists will have to explain the origin of perceptions.
Перевернет вообще всю офтальмологию. Почему? Потому что надо будет сказать, а откуда идут формы. Значит, надо признать, что есть еще что-то.
They would have to admit and fully explain that something, beyond of what we actually see, exists. As I said previously, the vision as we know it, it's a sheer illusion. Everyone sees strictly their own way. That summarizes it.